So, good morning, students. So, welcome you all to another session. So, let's begin today's session, right? So, till the previous session, we have completed with the first chapter, which is called as the animal kingdom. So, both the cortex as well as the non-cortex, right? So, today, let's begin with the next chapter, what we have in the list, which is called as the structural organization in animals, right? So, today, we'll be taking up with the next topic, which is called as the structural organization in animals, right? So, let's begin today's session by taking up with the structural organization in animals. Okay, so this would be the next topic what we have in the list after the animal kingdom, the structural organization in animals. Now this chapter has two parts in it, so we'll be taking up with each part also in little detail. The first part of the chapter will be taking up with the tissues part, which is called as the animal tissues. And once we have completed with the animal tissues, let's get into the case studies of three organisms that we have in the list. That is the earthworm, the cockroach, and the frog, right? So in this session, let us begin with the first topic, which is called as the animal tissues. Now, talking about animal tissues, we know that tissue level organization is said to be the first key transition during the course of evolution. So we have studied this in our previous chapter where we said that formation of tissues is actually considered as the first key transition during the course of evolution. So before the tissues were actually formed, all organisms were actually present in that cellular level of organization where all the cells were aggregated to form one single organism, and each cell started working independently, right? It was not dependent on the other cell, and for the survival of that particular cell, all the physiological processes has to be taken place in that particular cell itself. But later on, due to coordination between the cell, right? So due to coordination between the cell, what exactly happened is all the cells which perform the same function and all the cells which had the same origin were grouped together to form one single structure, and that single structure is what we call it as a tissue. So if we have to define tissue, how do we define tissue? A group of cells which perform the same function and which have the same origin have been grouped as this particular structure, which is called as tissue. So formation of tissue was actually considered as the first key transition during the course of evolution, right? So that's what most of the evolutionary biologists actually believe in. Right. Now, what is the advantages of tissues? What is the advantages of tissues? Initially, when there were no tissue formation, each cell was working independently. So for their survival, as I've already mentioned, all the physiological processes of a particular organism has to be taken place by that particular cell only. But once tissues started to form, the sharing of the work actually began, right? So all the cells, they started sharing that particular work so that work would be completed at a faster pace, number one. Number two, the work would be completed in a more efficient manner, right? It would have been completed at a faster pace and in a very much efficient manner. That is the importance of tissues what we have. Now, even though there are billions of cells present in a higher organism, so we are not worried about the organisms having cellular level organization, we are talking about organisms from the tissue level organization. Even though the organism has several billions of cells, including the human beings, right? All the cells that are present in the body, right? They would fall under four basic tissues, right? Four basic types of tissues. So we'll be discussing about all those four basic types of tissues in a few couple of sessions later also, right? It all falls under these four basic types of tissues. So what are those four basic types of tissues? The first one, we would start calling it as we would start calling it as epithelial tissue. Second one is called the connective tissue. The third one is referred to as the muscular tissue, and the fourth one is referred to as the nervous tissue, right? So you take any organism, any higher organism, right? Any organism having n number of cells, right? All of these cells have been grouped into these four types of tissue. Broadly, they are grouped into these four types of tissue: epithelial tissue, the muscular tissue, so epithelial tissue, the connective tissue, the muscular tissue, as well as the nervous tissue. So we'll take up with each of these tissue in detail. So even in case of humans also, we would have only these four types of tissue. So one of the scientists said that the number of cells that are present in the human body is approximately 3 trillion cells. So even though there are 3 trillion cells present in the human body, so what exactly is happening? All of these 3 trillion cells are actually divided into these 4 types of tissues, only what we actually have. Right? So let's start discussing the first type of tissue what we have in the list, which is called as the epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissue. Now, before we actually get into the epithelial tissue, a few introductory notes about the epithelial tissue. So, first, let's start discussing a few things with regards to the properties of the epithelial tissue. Then we'll get into the different types of epithelial tissue as well as the location of the epithelial tissue. As I always keep telling, the types of questions what you'll be getting mostly from this is with regards to the location. So you need to be very clear which type of tissue is present in which part of the body. So what is the location of the type of tissue that we are going to study, right? So let's begin with the properties of the epithelial tissue first, and then we'll get into the classification of the epithelial tissue, and then we'll start discussing about the different types of epithelial tissues what we have. Now talking about epithelial tissue, properties of the epithelial tissue. 4 major properties of the epithelial tissue what you should know. The first one, all the cells of the epithelial tissue, they are said to be compactly arranged, right? So this is the first property what we can say. They are said to be compactly arranged. So all cells of the epithelial tissue, they are said to be compactly arranged such that they do not have any intercellular space. So I hope all of you are familiar with what we mean by intercellular space, space that is present between the two cells. So due to the compact arrangement of the epithelial tissue, or the epithelial cells, what happens is there is no space present between the two cells. Even though the space is present, it would be very, very less, right? Very, very less intercellular space would be present. So if we just observe the cells, how we would observe is, say this is one cell, this is the other cell, so this is the other cell. So this is how we would actually observe the epithelial cells being present. So here we can observe that there is no space between the cell. Right? So there is, all the cells are said to be compactly arranged without any intercellular spaces. This is how the cells appear when we look at it from the sideways. If we have to look at it from the top, how do we observe the cells? The cells, when we look at it from the top, it would be observed very much similar to this. Right? So this is how the epithelial cells appear to be when we look at it from the top, and this will be the nucleus that is being present. So here also you can observe that there is no spaces present actually between the cells. That's the reason why we say all of the cells of the epithelial tissue, they are said to be compactly arranged without any intercellular spaces. If at all the intercellular spaces is present, it is said to be very, very little amount of intercellular space. This is the first property of the epithelial tissue, what we need to remember. The second property of the epithelial tissue is all the epithelial tissue, they usually rest on the basement membrane. They rest on the basement membrane. So all of the epithelial tissue, they usually rest on the basement membrane. Now what is this basement membrane? A membrane which is actually present here, right? So this particular epithelial tissue, they actually rest on this particular membrane, what we actually call it as the basement membrane. So this would be the basement membrane. So anywhere you find cells resting on the basement membrane, automatically we can assume that it is nothing but the epithelial tissue. So what is the importance of basement membrane? I'll just let you know once we take up the next point, right? So this is the second property or the second characteristic feature of the epithelial tissue. First one, all the cells are said to be compactly arranged, right? Second one, they always rest on the basement membrane. The third important thing is all of the epithelial tissue, they are all said to be avascular. Right? All epithelial tissues are said to be avascular. Now, what do we mean by avascular? There is no blood vessels, right? So, epithelial tissue are not provided with blood vessels. Now, again, a question might arise. If they do not have blood vessels, if they do not possess blood vessels, how are these cells surviving? Because we know that for any cell to survive, what is required? They require oxygen, they require gases, as well as they require nutrients. And oxygen and nutrients are actually supplied through the blood, by the blood vessels, right? So if blood vessels are absent in the epithelial tissue, how do they get their nutrients and oxygen for their survival, right? How do they get this? Because how do they get this? Let me just put it up here. Right below the epithelial tissue, right? So right below the epithelial tissue, there is always a base. There is always a basement membrane. I've said. Below the basement membrane, there is long cells or large cells which are called as the connective tissue. So this would be the second type of tissue, which is called the connective tissue. So this would be the basement membrane. Sorry, the epithelial tissue. Below the epithelial tissue would be the basement membrane. Below the basement membrane would be the connective tissue. So this connective tissue is richly provided with the blood vessels, right? Richly provided with blood vessels. As a result of which, the connective tissue will start carrying the nutrients as well as oxygen, and it would give those nutrients as well as oxygen to the basement membrane. From the basement membrane, all the nutrients and oxygen that is required for the epithelial tissue will be diffused into the epithelial tissue from the basement membrane. That is the importance of basement membrane, what I just said. Right? So what basement membrane does is it will start receiving the nutrients as well as oxygen from the connective tissue. As a result of which, what is happening? The nutrients and oxygen from the basement membrane will now be diffused into the epithelial tissue that are present. That's how the epithelial tissue actually survives. Right? So this is what we have with the three properties of the epithelial tissue: compactly arranged without any intercellular spaces. They always rest on the basement membrane, and they are also said to be avascular. Right. The fourth important property is epithelial tissue always have free apical surface. They always have a free apical surface. That is, the topmost part, the anterior part of the surface is always said to be free. Right? So, bottom part, posterior part always rests on the basement membrane, whereas the anterior part would always rests on the basement membrane. Sorry, it is always said to have a free surface. And that free surface, this top surface we are talking about, so that free surface of the top surface is usually referred to as the apical surfaces. Right? So, they always have a free apical surface, and this free apical surface always undergoes some sort of modifications, right? They would undergo modifications where some of these cells of the epithelial tissue on their apical surfaces, they would start possessing cilia, right? If cilia is present, we would start calling them as ciliated epithelial tissue. Some of them will start having something called as a stereocilia, which is nothing but immotile form of a cilia, which is called as stereocilia. So they may have stereocilia present on their apical surface. Some of them will start having some sort of folds like this, which are usually referred to as the villi or the microvilli, right? So some of them may have this microvilli being present. Right? So the free surface of the epithelial tissue, that is the apical surface, is always said to be free, and due to the presence of free apical surface, there are some sort of modifications actually happening in this particular apical surfaces of the epithelial tissue, and that's how the functions of the epithelial tissue actually varies. So based on what sort of modification is present on the apical surfaces or the apical surfaces, the function of that particular epithelial tissue would actually change, right? So these are the four basic properties of the epithelial tissue what we have: compactly arranged without any intercellular spaces or with very, very little intercellular spaces. They always rest on the basement membrane, right? Number three, they are always said to be avascular, and the last one, they always have a free apical surface where where most of the times they will start undergoing some sort of modifications, right? So this is what we have with the basic properties of the epithelial tissue, right? So let's now take up with the types of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue could be broadly classified into two groups. Right? Epithelial tissue could be broadly classified into two categories based on the layers of cells that are actually present. Right? So we would start classifying epithelial tissue actually into two groups. The first one we would start calling it as simple epithelial tissue. The second one we would start calling it as compound epithelial tissue. Right? So these are the two types of epithelial tissues what we have: simple epithelial tissue as well as the compound epithelial tissue. Now talking about simple epithelial tissue, what does this actually simple epithelial tissue mean? There is only one single layer of cells. Right? There is only one single layer of cells resting on the basement membrane. So this is how the simple epithelial tissue actually look like. right? So this would be the nucleus that is present. They always rest on the basement membrane. So there is only one single layer of cells resting on the basement membrane. We would start classifying it as simple epithelial tissue. Second one, what we have in the list is called compound epithelial tissue, where there are multiple layers which actually rest on the basement membrane. So if this is the basement membrane, what we're talking about, and here on top of the basement membrane, there will be this layer of cells. So if there is only one single layer, we call it as simple epithelial tissue. But if there are multiple layers present like this, then we will start calling it as compound epithelial tissue. So based on the number of layers present, we would start classifying the epithelial tissue into these two categories. One is called the simple epithelial tissue and the compound epithelial tissue. Let's first take up with the simple epithelial tissue and we'll see what are the different types under simple epithelial tissue, and let us take up with their locations as well. Right. So let's begin with the simple epithelial tissue. Now talking about simple epithelial tissue, right? We would again have different classes under simple epithelial tissue. Based on this time, it is based on the shape of the cell. So based on the shape of the cell, we would start classifying simple epithelial tissue into three different groups. Right. So based on the number of, based on the shape of the cell, we would start classifying the simple epithelial tissue into three different categories. One, we have something called as, let us just take up to that. The first one, what we have under simple epithelial tissue is called as squamous epithelial tissue or squamous epithelial tissue. We can call it as simple squamous epithelial tissue. So this is the first category what we have. Now what are the cells or what is the type of cells in simple squamous epithelial tissue is all of these cells, they are said to be flat cells. Right, so they are said to be flat cells with centrally located nucleus, right? So they are said to be flat cells with centrally located nucleus. Now, how do they actually look like? Say this is the basement membrane, what we are talking about. On the basement membrane, there are these flat cells that are actually present like this. And they would all have a centrally located nucleus. So if this is the type of cell, we would start calling them as simple squamous epithelial tissue. Simple because there is only one single layer. Squamous epithelium because they are flat cells that are actually being present. Now, this is how the cell appears to be when we look at it from the top, from the sideways. But when we look at it from the top, the cells usually appear to be somewhat like this. So this is how the simple squamous epithelial tissue actually look like. So this is how the cells of the epithelial tissue or squamous epithelial tissue actually appear with centrally located nucleus. Right. Now this arrangement gives us the appearance of a pavement. Right. It gives us the appearance of a pavement. Therefore, simple squamous epithelial tissue, they are also referred to as the pavement membrane. Right? So it gives us the appearance of a pavement. Therefore, we would also start calling it as the pavement membrane. So simple squamous epithelial tissue, also called as the pavement membrane. Now, what is the location of this simple squamous epithelial tissue? Where do we have the simple squamous epithelial tissue? Simple squamous epithelial tissue is present wherever there is exchange of substances actually happening. Right? This way you can remember. Based on the function, we can actually identify what would be the location of this particular type of tissue. So wherever there is exchange of substances happening in our body, at that place we would have the simple squamous epithelial tissue. Now, where exactly is exchange of substances happening in our body? The first place we can take it as the alveoli. So alveoli of the lungs. Right? So in the alveoli of the lungs, this is one place where we would have simple squamous epithelial tissue. So I hope all of you are familiar with alveoli, right? So this would be the sac-like structure of the alveoli where the bronchioles actually open, right? So the air passes through the respiratory tract and the last part of the respiratory tract is nothing but these sac-like structures which are called as alveoli. So this alveoli is actually lined by this simple squamous epithelial tissue. Right, so there is the simple squamous epithelial tissue which is seen lining the alveoli. Right, so what exactly happens once oxygen enters into the alveoli? Right, this oxygen from the alveoli will now is exchanged into the, or it is exchanged between the alveoli as well as the blood. Again, we know how exactly is this exchange happening through the process of diffusion based on concentration gradient. The oxygen that is present here will be actually diffused through this. So there is exchange of oxygen happening between alveoli as well as the blood vessel. So this is one place where we would have simple squamous epithelial tissue. The second place what we can take is, or the second location, a lining of the capillaries. Lining of the capillaries, right? So capillaries are nothing but smaller branches of the blood vessel which would actually penetrate into the tissues. So this would be a blood capillary, and this blood capillary also is lined by this simple squamous epithelial tissue, right? This is also lined by the simple squamous epithelial tissue. So the lining of the blood capillary, we usually call it as the endothelium, right? So in the endothelium also, we would have this sort of epithelial tissue, which is nothing but the simple squamous epithelial tissue that is actually being present, right? So wherever there is exchange, and again we know that in the blood capillaries there would be carbon dioxide present. So this carbon dioxide will be exchanged with that of oxygen. Right? So there is exchange of substances happening between alveoli as well as the blood capillaries. So wherever there is exchange of substances happening in the body, there we would have this simple squamous epithelial tissue, because a single layer of flat cells are required for the process of exchange of substances. If the layer is thick, again the exchange will not happen. Right? So we have simple squamous epithelial tissue being present in those particular places. Right? So this is the first type of epithelial tissue what we have, which is called as the squamous epithelial tissue. Right. Now let's get into the second type of epithelial tissue. The second type of epithelial tissue what we have in the list is called as the simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. So the second one would be simple cuboidal. Simple we have already written that. So we would have the cuboidal epithelial tissue. Now talking about the cuboidal epithelial tissue, again from the name we can make out what would be the shape of it. Cuboid, it would be cuboid, somewhat squarish in shape, right? It would be cuboid or it would be somewhat squarish in shape. So how does that particular cells look like? So this would be the basement membrane what we have, right? On the basement membrane there are these cuboidal cells that are actually present. Right? And they also have a centrally placed nucleus or centrally located nucleus. This is how the cuboidal epithelial tissue actually look. Where do we have this cuboidal epithelial tissue? Cuboidal epithelial tissue are mostly present in the germinal epithelial cells. So all germinal epithelial cells are nothing but cuboidal epithelial cells. So I hope all of you are familiar with germinal epithelial cells, because we have already discussed about the germinal epithelial cells when we were talking about the process of reproduction, the human reproductive system. Germinal epithelial cells. So these germinal epithelial cells are the ones which would actually get transformed into the male gamete as well as the female gamete. Right? So all germinal epithelial cells present in the testis as well as ovary, they are nothing but this cuboidal epithelial cells. Right. Now this cuboidal epithelial cells, or the apical surface of the cuboidal epithelial cells, would undergo one modification where they would start having cilia at the top. Right. So they would start undergoing one modification. So this is one modification of the cuboidal epithelial cells, where they would possess cilia at the apical surface or the free surface. Now, if cilia is present on the free surface, we would start calling it as ciliated. So this is the first modification. It is called ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue. That is one modification shown here, which is called as ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue. Now, where do we have the ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue? Let us take up with the locations part. Location wise, the ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue is present in the nephron tubules. So we have already studied about the nephron tubules. Remember, get back to the structure of nephron, the human nephron. We have different parts in that, right? So we have something called as the Bowman's capsule. Bowman's capsule opens up into a convoluted tubule, which is called as the proximal convoluted tubule. proximal convoluted tubule into the next tubule, which is called as the loop of Henle. Loop of Henle opens up into another tubule, the distal convoluted tubule. Then we would have the collecting tubule being present, right? So in the nephron tubules, we would have this sort of epithelial tissue, which is called as the ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue. Let us take up one more location, then we get to the function of this particular structure. Right. So the another place where we would have this cuboidal epithelial tissue is in the respiratory tract. Right. So in the respiratory tract, the cuboidal epithelial tissues are actually present. So in the human respiratory tract, we know the respiratory tract begins from the nostrils and it enters and it goes up to the alveoli. So throughout the respiratory tract, the cells lining the respiratory tract, a few places here and there, some exceptions with that, so that will take up a little later. Right, in the upper respiratory tract, we have another type of epithelial tissue, but majorly throughout the respiratory tract, we would have this ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue that is being present. Right? So these are the locations of ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue. Now, what would be the role of ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue? Wherever there is conduction of substances happening, right? So wherever there is conduction of substances happening, we would have this ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue being present, because we know the function of cilia, right? So cilia moves. There is movement actually seen. We would start calling it as the flip-flap movement, which is expressed by this particular cilia. Right. Now, as and when the cilia keeps moving, it would start transferring the molecules from one cell to the other cell, or from one part of the tissue to the other part of the tissue. So wherever there is conduction of cells, conduction of substances or molecules happening, there the cilia would be present. Or we can put it this way: wherever cilia is present, we would have conduction or movement of either the molecules or the substances actually happen. So the major role of ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue is nothing but conduction. Right? So this is the second type of epithelial tissue. What we have, simple epithelial tissue, which is called as the cuboidal, simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. What we actually have. Next, moving on to the third one, which is called as columnar epithelial tissue. So we would start calling it as simple columnar epithelial tissue. Again, the reason why we call it as simple columnar epithelial tissue, because there is only one single layer. Now these are said to be long cells. So this is the basement membrane, right? So on the basement membrane, we would have this long pillar-like cells that are present. So these are long, slender, pillar-like cells that are present, and they have a basally located nucleus. The nucleus is said to be located at the base. So this is how the columnar epithelial tissue actually look like, right? So the columnar epithelial tissue, they are long cells, slender cells, and they are said to be pillar-like cells with the basally located nucleus. Nucleus being located at the base. Again, remember, epithelial tissue, so they always rest on a basement membrane. Simple epithelial tissue, only one single layer. Now, this epithelial tissue, that is columnar epithelial tissue, undergoes different modifications, right? It would undergo different modifications. So let us see what are those modifications. In the first modification, I'm just putting it here itself. So this would be the first modification, where they would start having cilia on their free surface. Right, where they would start having cilia on their free surface. So if cilia is present on the free surface, we would start calling them as ciliated. So the first one would be ciliated columnar simple epithelial tissue. So this is the first one what we have. That is nothing but ciliated columnar simple epithelial tissue. Again, now since there is cilia being present, we know what would be the function of this type of tissue. The function of this type of tissue possessing cilia would again be conduction, because we just discussed now, right? Wherever there is cilia present in the body, their major role is nothing but conduction or transportation or movement of molecules or substances. Now, in which part of the body do we have this ciliated columnar epithelial tissue? Ciliated columnar epithelial tissue would be present in the fallopian tube, or we can put it this one itself, the nephron tubules. So one location where we would have it, it would be the nephron tubules. So in nephron tubules, there are two types of epithelial tissue being present. You need to remember this. There is cuboidal epithelial tissue being present, as well as columnar epithelial tissue also being present in the nephron tubules. So once we get into the structure of nephron, there we'll see in detail where, in which part of the nephron, which type of epithelial tissue is being present, right? So for now, remember that the nephron tubules consists of both ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue as well as ciliated columnar epithelial tissue also. Right. Next, one more function, one more location is we would have it in the fallopian tube. Fallopian tubes, right? So fallopian tubes, so we have already studied about the structure of fallopian tube, all that in detail when we took up with the human reproductive system. So even in the fallopian tube also, for the transportation of conduction of ovum, as well as for the conduction of the zygote after the process of fertilization, this ciliated epithelial tissue plays a very, very important role. So the type of epithelium present there is ciliated cuboidal epithelial tissue that is being present, right? So this is the first modification which is shown by columnar epithelial tissue. Now, the second modification which is shown by columnar epithelial tissue is there is infoldings present inside, right? So if this is the basement membrane what we have, and this is the long slender cells what we have. So on the apical surfaces, nucleus, on the apical surfaces, there are these folds which are being present, which are called as villi or microvilli. So if there is presence of villi or microvilli present on that free surface, we would actually start calling them as brush bordered epithelial tissue. So this is the second type of tissue what we have, which is called as the brush bordered epithelial tissue. So this is the brush border epithelial tissue. Second modification of the columnar epithelial tissue would be the brush border epithelial tissue, where there is presence of villi as well as microvilli that is being present. Now we know what is the role of villi and microvilli, right? So it would start increasing the surface area for absorption, right? So this would start increasing the surface area for absorption. Now what would be the function of this? Wherever absorption happens in our body, we would have this. So the function of this villi or microvilli or this brush bordered epithelium would be basically absorption. So wherever absorption happens in our body, we would have this particular thing. Now where exactly absorption happens in our body? The first place where there is absorption happening in our body is PCT, that is the proximal convoluted tubule. So in the proximal convoluted tubule, we would have this brush bordered epithelial tissue being present. Second place, we are all very much familiar with this, in the intestine. Right? So in the intestine, again, we would have this brush bordered epithelial tissue being present. Right? So this is what we have with the brush bordered epithelium, the second modification of the columnar epithelial tissue. So wherever absorption happens, we would have this particular epithelial tissue being present. So wherever there is absorption happening, we would have this brush bordered epithelial tissue being present. So this is the second modification. Now moving on to the third modification, some of the cells of the columnar epithelial tissue, they would get modified and they would become glandular. So this is the basement membrane and these are the cells. Right? So some of them would get modified and they would become glandular. Like this, right? So they would start becoming glandular. So some of those cells, they would get modified and they would start becoming gland. So they would start secreting certain substances and all of these substances will actually be released to the outside. So this type of epithelial tissue, we would start calling them as glandular epithelial tissue. So we would start calling them as glandular epithelial tissue. So several places in our body we would have this glandular epithelial tissue actually being present, right? So wherever there is secretions happening in our body, the type of epithelial tissue there is glandular epithelial tissue. In the skin itself, we have two types of glandular epithelial tissue. One is called the sebaceous gland, right? That is another epithelial tissue. The other one, what we have is called sudoriferous gland, the sweat gland, that is again said to be a glandular epithelial tissue. So three modifications of the columnar epithelial tissue, what we have seen: ciliated columnar epithelial tissue, brush bordered epithelial tissue, as well as the glandular epithelial tissue, right? So this is what we have in the simple epithelial tissue, where there is only one single layer of cells and all of these cells are resting on the basement membrane. And they have different modifications. Based on the modifications, we would find out what would be the function of it. Again, based on the function, we would be clearly able to say what would be the location of these sort of cells that are present. Right? So this is what we have a simple epithelial tissue. Now, moving on to the next one, which is called compound epithelial tissue. Right? So moving on to the the compound epithelial tissue. So compound epithelial tissue, we would also start calling it as stratified epithelial tissue, because as I've already mentioned, they are seen in case of layers, So therefore, formation of layers, we know it is nothing but strata, stratification. So we have next one is the compound epithelial tissue. So under compound epithelial tissue, as we have already mentioned, I told you that there are multiple layers of cells which would rest on the basement membrane. Again, this compound epithelial tissue is classified into three different groups. Again, same thing based on the structure, of which the first one is said to be squamous epithelial tissue. Now, squamous epithelial tissue, we know that they are flat cells, but only difference between simple and compound is even though flat cells are present here, there are multiple layers of cells being present. So we would start calling it as squamous epithelial tissue, compound squamous epithelial tissue. Now this compound squamous epithelial tissue has two types again. There are two classes under this again. One is called as keratinized squamous epithelial tissue. Keratinized squamous epithelial tissue. And the second one would be non-keratinized squamous epithelial tissue. Right. So let us see what are the locations of this column. So before that, let me just show you this diagram here. So this is the basement membrane, and here we would have these squamous epithelial tissue being present, and there is another layer of squamous epithelial tissue being present. There is one more layer of squamous epithelial tissue. So let me just put one more layer. Right? So this would be compound epithelial tissue, stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Now, in the first type, we have mentioned that there would be keratin deposition. Right? So keratin would be actually deposited on the top layers of the epithelium. Right? So if there is keratin being deposited on the top layers of the epithelial tissue, we would start calling it as keratinized squamous epithelial tissue. Now, where do we have this keratinized squamous epithelial tissue? So this would be present in the skin. So remember, wherever there is keratin being deposited, that part of the body appears to be hard and it appears to be tough. Major role of this is again said to be protection. So in the skin, we would have this keratinized squamous epithelial tissue. Then in the palm and in the sole. Right? So in the palm region, what we have, right? So in the palm region, what we have here, what we have is nothing but the keratinized squamous epithelial tissue, and also in the sole also. That is the reason why our palm and sole is said to be rough compared to any other part of the body, because there is more of keratin being deposited in the palms and sole. Similarly, even in the skin also, we would have more of keratin being deposited, whose major role is to protect. The major function is protection, right? So this is what we have at the locations of keratinized squamous epithelial tissue. Now talking about non-keratinized. Non-keratinized, from the name itself we can make out, they do not have keratin deposition. Now since they do not have keratin deposition, we would start calling them as non-keratinized squamous epithelial tissue. Right. Now what is the location of this? Location of this is they are actually present in the cornea of the eye. So I hope all of you are familiar with cornea. So in the cornea of the eye, we would have this non-keratinized squamous epithelial tissue. Then in the inner lining of lips, right? And along with that, it is also present in the vagina, in the foreskin, right? Foreskin, parts of cervix. So all these are the places where we would actually have non-keratinized squamous epithelial tissue. It is present in the cornea of the eye, inner lining of the lips. It is present in vagina, the foreskin, as well as some parts of the cervix as well. Right? So this is what we have with non-keratinized squamous epithelial tissue. Right? Talking about the second one. The second one would be cuboidal epithelial tissue. So this would be stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue. Now, how does this stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue look like? Again, the same thing here. The basement membrane would be present, and on the basement membrane, we would have this cuboidal epithelial cells being present, and there are multiple layers of the cuboidal epithelial cells being present. So this is how the cuboidal epithelial cells actually look. Stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue. Right? So this is how the stratified cuboidal epithelium actually looks like. Now, where do we have this stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue? It is usually present in the the lining of the ducts. It is present in the lining of the ducts of the glands. right? So we know that some of the glands have ducts into which the secretions are being poured. Such type of gland we would start calling it as exocrine gland, right? Where they are connected to the duct and all the secretions are actually poured into the duct, right? So lining those ducts of the gland, lining the ducts of the salivary gland, lining the ducts of the mammary gland, right? So we would have this cuboidal epithelial tissue being present, that is stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue being present. And finally, we have the third cell, which is called as the columnar epithelial cell tissue. Right? This is would be stratified columnar epithelial tissue. Again, the same thing. Structure, it would appear to be as a pillar-like cells, long pillar-like cells with the nucleus at the base, right? And they are seen in multiple layers, right? So wherever there is maximum friction present in the body, or wherever there is maximum friction happening in our body, there we would actually have this stratified columnar epithelial tissue. So let me just quickly give you the locations where we would have this columnar epithelial tissue, that is stratified columnar epithelial tissue. It is actually present in the uh, conjunctiva. It is present in the conjunctiva of the eye. So I hope all of you are familiar with conjunctiva of the eye. Second one, it is present in the anus. Next, it is present in the pharynx. So these are the places where there is maximum friction actually happening. Right? Because of the continuous movement of substances passing through these particular structures, there is maximum friction actually happening. So wherever there is maximum friction, we would have this stratified columnar epithelial tissue actually being present. Right? So this is what we have the stratified epithelium, stratified squamous. Under that we have keratinized and non-keratinized epithelial tissue, their locations. Then the cuboidal as well as the columnar epithelial tissue and their location. Right? So this is what we have in the compound epithelial tissue. So simple epithelial tissue, compound epithelial tissue, their types as well as the locations I just mentioned. Now, there are two specialized types of epithelial tissue being present. One is called transitional epithelium and the other one is called as pseudostratified epithelium. So let us just quickly look at what we actually mean by transitional epithelium as well as pseudostratified epithelium. So these are actually considered to be specialized type of epithelial tissue. One is transitional epithelial tissue. Now, what exactly this transitional epithelial tissue is? Actually speaking, it is a stratified epithelial tissue. Transitional epithelium is said to be a stratified epithelial tissue. It is said to be basically a stratified epithelial tissue. But during some processes, the stratified epithelial tissue will start stretching, as a result of which it would get converted into simple epithelial tissue. Best example what we can take, location wise, we can take it as it is present in the urinary bladder. It is present in the urinary bladder. So we know in normal conditions, urinary bladder is actually lined by stratified epithelial tissue. But whenever the bladder gets filled with urine, the urinary bladder stretches. As a result of which, what exactly is happening? Stratified epithelial tissue is getting converted into simple epithelial tissue. But again, once during the process of maturation occurs, once the urine is being released or excreted, at that point of time, again, the simple epithelial tissue will now be transformed back into stratified epithelial tissue. So there is always a transition between simple epithelial tissue as well as a compound epithelial tissue. That's the reason why we would start calling it as transitional epithelial tissue. So this is one type of specialized epithelial tissue that is being present because it has the characters of both simple as well as the compound epithelial tissue. It can exist in both simple as well as compound epithelial tissue. Second type what we have here is called as the pseudostratified epithelial tissue. So this would be the last type what we have, which is called as pseudostratified epithelial tissue. The pseudostratified epithelial tissue. Now, talking about the pseudostratified epithelial tissue, basically this is actually said to be a simple epithelium, right? Basically, it is said to be a simple epithelial tissue only. But due to the differences in the size or due to the differences in the arrangement of the nucleus, it appears to be like it is a multiple layer, right? Actually speaking, simple layer only, simple epithelium only. But due to some reasons, it appears to be in the form of a multiple layers. Therefore, it gives us a false assumption that it is a stratified epithelium. That is the reason why we start calling it as pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue. Now this pseudostratified epithelial tissue undergoes three modifications, right? So let me just quickly show you that. The first one is presence of cilia. We would start calling it as ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. By the way, all of these pseudostratified epithelial tissue are all said to be columnar epithelial tissue. So we can also call it as pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. The first modification is ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. Now, this type of epithelial tissue is usually seen in the upper respiratory tract. So in the upper respiratory tract, you would have this ciliated pseudostratified epithelial tissue being present. Second modification is presence of stereocilia. We would call it as stereociliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. So this is the second modification where there is presence of stereocilia on their free surface. Now, if stereocilia is present, we would start calling it a stereociliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. Now, where do we have this? Location where do we have this is it is present in the epididymis. So I hope all of you are familiar with the structure called epididymis. So it is a part of the male reproductive system. So in the male reproductive system, there is this stereociliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue being present. The last one is there is no cilia or there is no stereocilia. So we would start calling it as non-ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. So this is the third one, non-ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. Now again, where do we have this again? It is present in the vas deferens. So vas deferens also is a part of the male reproductive system, right? So this is what we have with the pseudostratified epithelial tissue. Remember, basically it is a simple epithelial tissue, but it gives us a false assumption that it is seen in multiple layers, a stratified epithelium. Therefore, we would start calling it as pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue, right? So this is what we have with all of the epithelial tissues that are present, right? So the different types of epithelial tissues we have seen, as well as their locations, what you say. As I've already mentioned at the beginning of the session, maximum questions what you'll be getting from this is based on the type as well as the locations where they are actually present, right? So with this, we have done with the first type of animal tissue, which is called the epithelial tissue, right? So in the next session, we'll take up with the second type of animal tissue, which is called as the connective tissue, right? Thank you.